Welcome to another fun-filled factoring edition of Comet Algebra. This video is for Algebra 1, Chapter 10, Section 3, Factoring by Grouping. I'm changing the title a little bit from your book. We're calling it Factoring by Grouping when the leading coefficient is not 1. In the last section, when we had a different leading coefficient, we used the GCF method to factor it out. Okay, first of all, to make sure you know, the leading coefficient is the number that's in front of the term that has the highest exponent. And in this section, we're going to be dealing with x squared, so the leading coefficient is the number in front of the x squared. And now it's not going to be 1, it's going to be a different number that cannot be factored out with the GCF method. So this does change our factoring. We're still going to use the diamond method, but this is only going to be step 1. We're going to add a step called the grouping method for step 2. So it's a little bit tougher, but we can handle it. Now we'll list out the steps here in just a minute, but first I want to practice something with you. I want you to look at these two examples that I have given the directions of factor using the GCF method. So when you first take a look at this, you might think, wow, there is no GCF. These terms look weird, and what is she talking about? But if you look a little closer, you'll see they actually do have a GCF. They do share something in common. This first term, I'll just underline the term, it has an x minus 5 in it, in parentheses. This second term also has an x minus 5 in parentheses. So if I asked you to find the GCF of these two terms, the GCF is x minus 5, and I'm going to leave it in parentheses. So if you divide x minus 5 out of this first term, all that is left is the x. If you divide x minus 5 out of this second term, all that is left is a 7, and this 7 does have a plus sign in front of it. So what's left goes, of course, in parentheses, just like it does with any other GCF. And we have the x, we have the plus sign, and we have the 7 left behind. So basically we pulled out an x minus 5 out of both terms. So pause the video and go ahead and do the GCF factoring on this second example. I hope you noticed that the GCF itself is a plus 3b. And then we put what's left in parentheses. What's left here is a 2a. And what is left here is a minus 7. And so now we have the product of two binomials. This skill is very necessary for the steps we're going to do in the method of factoring by grouping. Looking over these steps now, this first part should be extremely familiar because it's exactly the same as what we did with the diamond. Step 1, we multiplied the first term by the last and put it on top of the diamond. Put the middle term in the bottom of the diamond, and then find two factors that multiply to give you the top, at the same time multiply to give you the bottom, and write them on the sides of the diamond. Okay, so far very repetitious. This is where the new part comes in. In the expression that we're factoring, we take out the middle term and we put in the two factors that we just found in our diamond. Because the two terms that we found in the diamond equal, this is a very important word here, when you add them together, they equal the middle term. So it's kind of like a little substitution. You pull out the middle term and put in those two factors. Then we do the factoring by grouping. We group the first two terms together and find their GCF. We group the last two terms together and find their GCF. So it's like a double GCF problem. And then we'll have something like the examples that we just did above, where you have a polynomial with two kind of large terms, but they share a binomial factor. This binomial is the GCF. And so we factor it from both and write them as two binomials. And of course, we can always check using the FOIL method. And once again, if these steps aren't crystal clear, they will become clear as we do some examples together. All right, of course, we always check when we're going to factor, we check for GCF, and this time they do not share a GCF, so we go right into our diamond method. First times last is 6x squared. Put that on top of the diamond, put the middle term on the bottom, and now come up with two factors here that multiply to 6x squared and add to 7x. And we can't use 2 and 3 this time because they add to 5, but 6 and 1 adds to 7. So now let's do our substitution over here. Let's remove this middle term and let's put in 6x plus 1x. So we write that, we keep our first term, we put 6x plus 1x, and then plus 2. And just so you realize, 7x is 6x plus 1. We've just done a little substitution. So now this is where we factor by grouping. We group these two terms together and do their GCF. 3x squared and 6x share a factor of 3, and they share a factor of x. So if we GCF that out, 3x squared divided by 3x is just x. Keep your plus sign. 6x divided by 3x is 2. Again, this is a plus sign, so we keep it. And I'm going to underline these second two, that we are grouping them together, and we're doing their GCF. What do 1x and 2 have in common as a GCF? All I can see is a 1. So I'm going to write that there, and I don't need the 1 here in front. I'm going to write this as x plus 2. And if we did these correctly and they can be factored, do you see how these binomials match each other? So now this is like the problems we just did above. Now we do another GCF. This term, this front term, and this back term, they share an x plus 2. So let's put that in front as our GCF and put in parentheses what we have left. We have a 3x and we have a plus 1. So this is the original trinomial factored, and we can FOIL it to check it. When I FOIL it, I see that this adds to 7x, and it does give me the original trinomial I started with. So our factoring checks out. Let's look at example 2 now. I'm always checking for a GCF, not seeing any, so we proceed to our diamond. First times last is negative 30x squared. The middle term is 1x. The two things that multiply to get 30 and add to get a 1 would be a 6x and a 5x. And in order for the 1 to be positive, this would be negative. So now we do a substitution. We take out this 1x and we put in the two factors that we found in the diamond that do add up to 1x. So now I have 6x squared plus 6x minus 5x minus 5. Again, we take these first two and we do the GCF. That's the grouping. We put these second two together and find their GCF with grouping. That's what grouping means, is we're grouping different things together. So the first two terms both have a 6 and an x. And if we factor that out, we're left with x plus 1. Okay, now this is a minus. So 5x and 5 both have a negative 5 in them. So we're going to factor out a negative 5. Dividing that out of the first term, we have an x, and negative 5 divided by itself is a 1. And we always want to end up with a match here. And if we had a negative x and a negative 1, and then we realized we had to factor out a negative 5, so just check your signs. Now x plus 1 is the new GCF, so we pull it out in front, and what's left behind is 6x minus 5, and if you FOIL that, you will indeed end up with the original trinomial, so you can always check your answers. In example 3, again searching for GCF and not seeing any, we proceed to the diamond. 5 times 12, 60x squared on top, negative 32x on the bottom. So now we have to think of two numbers that multiply to 60 and add to 32. And when I said the 32, then I could kind of see it, that 30 times 2 gives us 60. And in order to get negative 32, these would both have to be negative. So now let's do the substitution in the original, where we take out this negative 32x and we put in the two factors that we found in our diamond. So then I have 5x squared minus 30x minus 2x plus 12. And then once again, we group them. We group the first two together and do the GCF. We group the second two together and do their GCF. These two both share a 5 and they both share an x, leaving me x minus 6. These two both share a negative 2. So we're going to factor out a negative 2, and we're left with x minus 6. Notice negative 2 times negative 6 gives me this positive 12. So be careful with your signs. The new GCF is the binomial x minus 6. So we pull that out of this term, leaving a 5x. Pulling it out of this term, leaving a negative 2. And once again, if you FOIL, you'll get this original trinomial, so it checks out. And I encourage you to always check your answers, especially on a test, so you can feel secure that you have factored correctly. All right, in these last two examples, they've thrown in a little extra letter, but the process remains exactly the same. We put first times last on top of the diamond, put the middle term in the bottom of the diamond, and find two factors that multiply to the top and add to the bottom. Hopefully we recognize that 7 times 5 is 35, and so the 7 and the 5 part aren't very difficult. And then to get the x squared y squared, this term would have to have an xy, and so would this term, because then when we add them, we're going to have an xy. Now we just have to check our signs. The 35 has to be negative, and the 2 has to be negative when we add. Therefore, the 7 would be negative. All right, let's do our substitution here. Now where we remove the negative 2xy, and we put in these two factors that we found in the diamond. So I hope you notice the process remains the same. We just have an extra y tagged on the end, so it's no big deal. So once again, we group the first two together and find the GCF, and all I see here in common is an x. So I have x minus 7y, and looking at these last two, I see we have a 5 in common, and just checking carefully, we also have a y in common. So we need to factor out a 5y. Leaving us with x minus 7y. And once again, we check to see if we have a match here, and indeed we do. So that becomes our new GCF, which we factor out of both terms. And once again, foiling it brings us back to our original, so our factoring checks. In our last example, looks like the numbers are getting a little bigger. So we once again go first times last on top of the diamond, middle term goes on the bottom of the diamond. If I did my multiplying right, 27 times 5 is 135. So now I have to find two factors that multiply to the top and add to the bottom. So I just entered 135 in my calc and I started dividing to see what it divides by. And I found that 9 times 15 is 135. And the 9 and the 15 are 6 units apart, so I knew this would work. But don't forget we have two letters involved, no big deal. And if we want this 6 to be negative, the 15 would have to be negative. So now we come over here, we take out the middle term and put in our two factors. Then we group the first two together and find the GCF. They both share an a in common, So we're going to factor out an a, and we have 5a plus 9b. Looking here, 15 and 27 both share a 3 in common, and not an a, but a b. So we're going to factor out a negative 3b out of each of these. What's left here is a 5 and an a, and what's left here, when we pull out the negative, it's positive. 27 divided by 3 is 9, and we have a b left. And once again, we're happy to see these two binomials match. They are the GCF that we pull out now, and what's left is a minus 3b. A lot of extra letters in there, but still the process remains the same. So now you have the knowledge you need to factor by grouping, so have fun with math.